Hello, I'm Judith Panero, Executive Director for AMC and AMC Foundation. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual discussion. We hope that you, our community of colleagues, allies, and supporters around the globe are healthy and safe. Our offices are in New York, and today I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn, location situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. The systemic violence and racism targeted at Black, Indigenous, and people of color is a harsh reminder of the inequities that persist in our society, particularly by the very institutions meant to protect them. AMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together, and to also take action to make change a reality. AMC's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving force of all our efforts. We call upon cultural organizations and the individuals working, funding, and serving them to take action to do better. We are dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for this webinar and all our programs, as well as the outlets to make direct or anonymous report of violation, has been posted in the chat feature. For many years, we have been presenting virtual programming and documenting live events, all of which are accessible on our website at artcurators.org or our YouTube channel. We hope they provide actionable advice, value, and connectivity. You can also stay up to date on our programming by registering for our communications. We are grateful to all our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. I also want to acknowledge our members here today and express our gratitude to them for their dedication in being part of our community. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin our program.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this exciting webinar today about emerging artists and identity work. My name is Tammy Landis, and this is going to be formatted as a conversation between three professionals working in diverse areas of the field. And we would love to hear from you all. Obviously, we're going to be talking about emerging artists and work centered around identity, but if things come up that you want to bring up because you all have other things to offer in other fields, please chime in on the Q&A box. Put in those questions, and I do want to reserve about 15 to 20 minutes at the end to go over some of those questions, or if it is appropriate and during our conversation, I might be able to chime in and bring that in to our conversation. So please participate. We look forward to hearing from you, especially seeing how many of you are from all over the world. We do want this to be a global conversation. So I am going to take a moment now and introduce our speakers who are joining me today. First, my name is Tammy Landis. I am based out in Washington State, up in Bellingham, Washington. I'm a museum educator and curator at the Western Gallery of Western Washington University. Next, we have Renin Burkhari, who is a curator, gallerist, and business developer, creator, curator. She is the creator and curator of Loud Art, a traveling platform for emerging experimental artists organized annually since 2012. She is a co-organizer of Huna Art, a casual art talk that has been happening bi-monthly since 2013 and is now expanding to go beyond the confines of the gallery walls and create pop-up art shows in all kinds of locations. In 2017, she co-curated Live Demo in February in Jeddah in collaboration with young upcoming artists. And I think it's important to note in 2018, Burkhari was included on the BBC list of inspiring and influential 100 women. So that's pretty fantastic. It's exciting to have you here today, Renin. And then next, my dear friend Brian Carpenter, based in Toledo, Ohio, who's an artist, curator, gallery director, assistant professor, based in Toledo, Ohio, utilizing a range of media through 2D to 3D methods. His work explores the pathological constructs of affliction and its relationship to history and cultural identity. So Brian has a lot to offer in terms of his own work with identity, but also Brian is a huge supporter of the arts in the Great Lakes region. He is the co-founder and director of Curation of Contemporary Art in Toledo, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the production, presentation, and promotion of ideas from visual artists from around the Great Lakes regions and the world. And he's the gallery director of a university gallery space at the University of Toledo that's attached to the Toledo Museum of Art. So Brian wears many hats, he's in many circles, and is working with all kinds of emerging artists in the area and brings a lot to this conversation, as well as students. So that's another important part of this conversation. So introduction into the topic today. I felt inspired to have this conversation when I saw that AAMC was focusing on the theme of identity at their 2021 conference. And I currently work at a university gallery where I do get to work with emerging artists who are especially working on their BFA bodies of work. And as I've sat in this work, I've noticed a continuation of students and early career artists, even outside of these students, really focused on identity in their work. They create these really experimental, kind of daring innovations where it's all centered about who they are, where they are, trying to define what's going on in the world and what's going on within them. And these bodies of work absolutely exude identity in so many different ways. So I felt like there needed to be this conversation in AAMC with curators about early career artists and that unique relationship of a curator to these artists and what that looks like. And that's why I brought in Renin and Brian today. So this panel seeks to explore the complex work of curating and exhibiting emerging artists whose work is centered on processing, formulating, challenging, or reimagining their identities. Emerging artists may include BFA, MFA, or solo exhibitions of early career bodies of work or group exhibitions, specifically those anchored in exposing themes of identity formation through societal, political, cultural, or personal narratives. We will be mainly talking about contemporary exhibitions. It will anchor this conversation, yet diverse medias, cultures, and global representation will be reflected in this discussion. So with that being said, we're gonna jump into this conversation. And now, audience, I want to remind you again, please chime in on the Q&A, and I will try to field those in, as I seem appropriate. And if not, we will save them for the last about 15 to 20 minutes end of our conversation. So let's start, Brian. Tell us where you are today and describe the cultural context of where you are and the emerging artists that you interact with.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Tammy. I'm located here in Toledo, Ohio. I think what really describes Toledo in a good way is its infrastructure. I think a little bit larger cities will have a substantial sort of encyclopedia museum. We have the Toledo Museum of Art. Usually those cities have a variety of different galleries and also a contemporary art museum along with them. Toledo doesn't. Toledo has that sort of main museum, the Toledo Museum of Art. And so over the years since I've been here, I sort of noticed that sort of foundation sort of missing. So over the years, I've developed a huge practice of getting younger emerging artists here in Toledo and around the Midwest area. I've been giving them platforms to, spaces to give them exhibitions. So for me, I think Toledo is really seeking, those sort of newer, younger artists whose work can be complicated sometimes and also engage in conversation about that work.
Great, thank you, Brian. And we will dive into more specifics of the artists and some of the projects Brian has had. But next I want to move on to Renin. I just want to clarify where everyone is and where we're coming from and what we're bringing to this conversation. So Renin, where are you today? And tell us about your relationship with emerging artists within your field.
Well, at the moment, I'm in Los Angeles. I've recently relocated, but most of my art career and my life has been in Saudi Arabia and between the three major cities of Khobar, Jeddah, and Riyadh. I've practiced curation in all of these spaces, but mostly working in non-gallery spaces, working in alternative spaces, because similar to what Brian was saying about Toledo, we don't have a lot of arts, spaces dedicated to the arts, which hopefully is changing in the next few years. But while I was working in 2012, it had to be makeshift spaces and working with artists that are trying to kind of break out of the mold of what the typical concept of art is. In Saudi, which we were talking about earlier, Tammy, which is mostly painting and experimenting with concepts, with ideas, with really trying to create not just different works for themselves, but create an atmosphere where everybody can be as creative as they like, which was beautiful to witness and be a part of. And now to see where it's all going, it's all very interesting to see how it's going to turn out.
Great, thank you, Renin. So what I want to talk to you next, and I think that this is something specific I want to hone in on this topic before we talk through some of your specific examples. But I think both of you have shared in our earlier conversations, there is a unique relationship being a curator working with emerging artists, early career artists. It's much different than, say, established and mid-career artists. Brian, could you speak to that a little bit? I know you talked some about this the other day about the hands-on aspect of it. So Brian, and then we'll go to Renin.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting to me because a lot of the younger emerging artists that I work with, I mean, they really want space. They want a platform to be able to exhibit their work. But I don't know all the time they know how that work exists in a space. So I'm that kind of guy that actually spends a lot of time in the studio with these artists. I drive around the Midwest and spend a lot of time with the artists and thinking about their work in relationship to space. And that's an opportunity I don't think a lot of emerging artists get. It's hard to find a good space. It's hard to get in a gallery sometimes. Museums don't necessarily take emerging artists. So I think for me, being super hands-on, getting in the studio with those artists, really thinking about how this work exists, also advocating to find spaces for them. One of the sort of blessing and curses about Toledo, like any sort of, Midwest Rust Belt city, is that we have a lot of buildings that aren't being used. So I'm also that guy that likes to go to a bunch of landlords and say, hey, can we take over the space? I've got this artist that wants to do this. I'm also really lucky that I have a university gallery, and I've sort of made it a mission to sort of really focus on younger artists. I think our students respond to them differently as well, and they bring up conversations for themselves that are similar. So they have a connection to those. I'm also really lucky because we have a space through Contemporary Art Toledo, the River House Arts Gallery downtown, that we utilize as well. So I think, how I work with those emerging artists is pretty intense. It's not a phone call or an email. I'm literally driving out there, literally spending time with them, literally talking about how does this exhibition exist? I help them with their statements. We talk about language. We talk about all of that stuff to really put their work out there in the right light once they get that opportunity.
Yeah, Renin, I know you have some overlap in talking about non-traditional spaces, right? Getting outside of the gallery. Would love to hear your answer. What is your relationship capacity, with these emerging artists?
Definitely very parallel to what Brian was saying. There's a lot that is needed and wanted from emerging artists that they don't receive from the people around them, their friends, their family, their even art spaces. Just like Brian said, they don't get into galleries, they don't get into museums. So it becomes like a very close relationship. You become almost like a collaborator or a co-conspirator. You're helping them with creating these just really pushing. They just need somebody to tell them hey, this can be a lot bigger. Like just, like let's try to think of a different way to put it out there. Instead of just digitally printing something, let's think of a different idea of how we can showcase this. So it becomes, I love your idea, I love your concept. Let's figure out on a way how to produce this. And then let's find a really amazing space that works, that people can have access to it. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to, what really made a difference is when artists started understanding that they don't have to show in an art gallery to have an importance or to have an impact or to have an audience. And that's what I try to like help them, not just with their like physical visual, like physically seeing an audience, no, but even online, and how the online presence can also make a big impact to artists, and how, and I did the opposite also. I took a lot of artists from online artists that were just showing on Instagram to then bringing them into a physical space. So that has been a really interesting movement. And I think you can only really get that excitement and get into the gritty with emerging artists.
It's kind of like, when you were talking, I was sort of thinking to myself, I think I'm like a curatorial social worker. It's the whole thing. I'm out there. I'm not holding their hands, but sometimes, like we talked about earlier, it's a new space and a new time for an artist, an emerging artist, and so I enjoy that part of it. It reminds me of the connections you made in grad school, those sort of crit spaces where, emerging artist has someone else they may not know really well to talk about their work in different ways.
Absolutely. And I think what I hear from both of you, you're really championing these artists. Like you said, you've offered them different spaces, you're giving them that encouragement, insight, you're kind of mentoring them a little bit. And I think maybe for some of the audience members, and maybe you're younger in museum study programs, maybe you're studying contemporary art, I think it's important to recognize how vital that relationship with an emerging artist and a curator is. That curator is going to be that person that's going to create those exhibitions, write those publications. Having someone write about you is huge, and furthering this emerging artist with these tactile and digital platforms and physical exhibitions is huge and fundamental to their success. And I think a lot of people don't realize how significant a curator is in really pivoting an artist towards success. If they never find a curator who's championing them, that's a really challenge to break through to the field and really be seen. So I think, go ahead, Brian, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a really good point, and something else that I actually enjoy doing for some of the emerging artists is the guy who's, emailing Hyperallergic or the local newspaper, getting that name out there of that emerging artist and getting someone to write about them is almost equally as important to me, I think, and to the artist as the exhibition is.
Now, before we jump into the specific examples that you all gathered for today, can you give me just a small thought that you have in terms of identity within the work of emerging artists, or something that you've seen consistently in the last year, with the pandemic, has it changed? Or maybe within the last 5 years, are there any consistencies or patterns or things that you've seen in terms of identity work within these emerging artists that you're working with? Brian, I'll have you go.
I mean, I've just seen more of an increase of identity work, actually. And it seems to be what I'm drawn to as far as putting on exhibitions. 4 or 5 years ago or so, I think, a lot of artists were working in identity. I also did a lot of exhibitions with design, but it just seems like more artists that I see kind of coming into view are working on major issues. Also issues of being sort of multicultural in a way, or being from one space, moving to another space, that idea and that transfer. Yeah. I just see more of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Renee, what about you?
I agree with Brian. We're very much on the same page with that. I think because there was less access to outside, there was less distraction, there was less things happening, there was less deadlines and just like noise. A lot of the artists that I work with have moved inwards. And so there's a lot of work about home, about safety, about just like ancestry, about lineage. Just there's a lot of exploration of not just like what's my identity, but what's made me into this person, which has been really interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you both would agree, but do you feel like you sense a different level of vulnerability with these emerging artists, especially in terms of work centered around identity?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. Some of the work I'm going to show today, these artists are thinking deeply about a subject. And some of them are literally putting themselves out there. And they're talking about things that may be difficult for people to talk about. So I think there's always a huge vulnerability in that space.
Mm-hmm. Something that illustrated what came to mind. I had an artist, one of the BFA artists 2 years ago, actually last fall, who created an immersive installation about her finding out that she was a sperm donor child, with these amazing textiles, but so in your face and so direct, and very much, when I would talk to her about her work, she'd be like, this is me trying to figure out who the heck I am and what's going on. And my birth story has been completely uprooted, and she created this really in your face, uncomfortable sperm donation center, in a university gallery. It was fantastic. And I don't know if I've seen that type of vulnerability, and her openness to talk about it was really amazing. So yeah, I would echo that. Absolutely, Brian.
And I don't think, historically speaking, I don't think, identity work has always been appreciated on some levels, or have been pushed aside. So that's that.
I definitely feel like personal work and identity work has always been associated with the feminine. And you always hear like more female artists who are like being personal. It's about her experience. But I see that vulnerability, as you said, permeate everybody. Like there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot happening. Everybody's going through something, and if you're not making art about what everybody's going through, then what are you doing? So yeah, I definitely feel that vulnerability change. That flux. Yeah.
Why don't we start giving some visuals? I'm sure our audience would appreciate to see some of these projects that we're talking about. So Renin, why don't I have you start us off? Renin's going to share about a few projects, and I may or may not chime in, but please just share a little bit, and then we'll go to Brian, and if we have time, I'll share a few of the artists I've been fortunate to work with.
Okay. So in 2012, I was fortunate enough to be able to have a space that my parents started that was a furniture store, and I asked them, hey, there are these artists that I really like and I want to showcase their work. And so it all started with an email to this artist. Her name is Basma Filimban, and she was doing these really cute, like, we're talking about a landscape where a lot of different art art schools don't exist in 2012 in Saudi Arabia. And so you're getting inspired by artists everywhere else. And so these are like Saudiized version of Space Invader artwork. And I asked her to come and spray them on the walls. And then she was so gracious. She came, and everybody got really excited about showing work, making work, having space to like experiment with things. And that was just the beginning of her journey. Right now, Basma Filimban is doing identity work, trying to understand her background, looking into what it means to be an immigrant, a second generation Saudi from Indonesia, what those stories are, and also what she can give back to the community that has given her so much. She's, of course, still in love with street art, and she has a platform called Saudi Street Art where she showcases what's happening on the ground. But she also studied at the Princess School of Traditional Arts because she was trying to make sense of what's come before. So Islamic art, Islamic architecture, geometric patterns, and then how to create that into her own world. I'm very inspired by her. We talk every day. She still sends me every single project that she's working on, because that's the kind of relationship that we've created. Even if I'm not her curator, it's still always like, can you look at my text? Can you look at my proposal? Can you look at my presentation? This is Sara Abdely. She was also part of the first art show that I did. She's went to the same school as Besma, the Princess School of Traditional Arts, but her style is so vastly different than hers. Also looking into her identity, because she is from Jeddah, she's indigenous, and she wanted to look at the stories of her ancestors, the women in her family, how they survived all these years in such a harsh place. And she tells her stories through different Islamic styles, Islamic art styles, and makes it her own. So she's also one of my very favorite artists, very inspiring. One of the few artists that I collect work from. And this last artist, his name is Mohamed Shono. He was part of my 2015 show. When he came to me, he had these very graphic novelish kind of artworks. He was going to the direction of creating a graphic novel, and then moved away, I guess you could say, but still holding on to the same style. But he moved into installation work. You can still see very much the same kind of emotion that's there. He's also looking into his identity as a family of immigrants coming into Saudi Arabia, movement, how people move, why people move, what it means to be in different spaces, what that looks like. And so we've connected over so many years, and it's just been amazing to watch him grow and change his practice into something else. But yeah, these are the three artists that I wanted to highlight that I feel like you can see the connection between their early works and the works that they're working on now. But yeah.
Absolutely. Renin, I want to pause really quick on this artist. So I know something you talked about earlier is like art spaces in general are challenging to find in Saudi Arabia. So when you see these large scale installations that he's doing, can you tell us a bit more? Like, where is he finding the space and support to create some of these installations?
Well, in the beginning, we were really, this art show that's on the left, that was in a co-working space, actually, that I asked them, like, hey, can we take over your space in the evenings when nobody's there? And so that was fun. But this work right here, this was done in an abandoned building. But this was heavily supported by government. So it was, because it was an abandoned, like a big abandoned palace, it was given to the artist to kind of experiment with and use in different ways. And so this is one of the artworks that Mohamed did. But yeah, this is new times in Saudi Arabia. They're actually being given spaces, warehouse spaces and palace spaces and outdoor spaces to experiment with freely.
And how would you say, you know, of these three artists, like, tell me about the reception by audience, by the general public. Like, how has their work been perceived? Has it changed, you know?
I feel like the audience, like the artist-audience relationship in Saudi is still very, very delicate, very new, very, very niche almost. Like it's very like specific to the same group of people, really, and that's something that we're really trying to change. Not having just art education in schools from an early age, not having museums that children can go to and that teenagers can go to when they're forming these ideas, makes a difference. And so that's what we're trying to change and what we're trying to push to change from grassroots programs and from top-down governmental programs. And so the audience awareness, I wouldn't say is like at its optimum, but the new generation, I feel they're very curious and they want to see different ways of being. So for them to have somebody to look up to that's not in the typical job description of what you have to be when you grow up to be an adult is interesting. So you'll see at these exhibitions, you'll see a lot of younger people that are still in school, that are still in the beginning of their college life, that just want to be inspired or see that, you know, you can survive being an artist. And so I feel like that's like the major part of the audience that are accepting, I guess you could say. Other people, it's still a work in progress.
Yeah. And, you know, I can't help but think about those young students that you're talking about, looking up to these emerging artists who are doing work on their identity, how much that perception is influenced by personal connection and shared cultural identity, that they can recognize and understand some of these topics a bit more of like, this is happening right now, and I see these artists addressing this, and how much that means to that generation. That must be really dynamic. That's great. Thank you for showing those three artists. I know I've written their names down. I hope some of our audience members have as well, to continue following them along. And you've done an amazing job, you know, supporting these artists. You can really see how their work is elevated. So Brian, let's jump into some of the projects and exhibitions that you wanted to share with us today, please.
Yeah, can you see this? Yeah. All right. So the first sort of artist I wanted to talk about was Jova Lynn. Jova Lynn is a curator. She's actually a curator at MoCAD, Museum of Contemporary Art, Detroit, and she's also an artist. I was really fascinated in the work she did in 2018, where she traveled to Jamaica to collaborate on a series of workshops with queer identified female spectrum Jamaicans. The workshop participants reflected on ways in which one cultivates their relationship to power and what it means to distill power through the body and through tools. These conversations, as well as the artist's own reflections on identity and family, sort of informed the portraits and the work in this exhibition. Jova was really open to like how things existed in the space. Like I said earlier, she knows what she's doing, but she was also wanting to explore and do things differently than she might do in her own job, which I was excited about. The second exhibition actually is of two different artists, and the exhibition was called Piece It Together, Art and Protest. The artists that were combined in this exhibition, or together, this two-person exhibition, were Shada Soleimani and Shanna Marola. I'll speak about Shada first. Shada is an Iranian-American artist. She is the daughter of political refugees. She inserts her own critical perspective on identity and the historical and contemporary social political occurrences in Iran. Her series of work in this exhibition, Piece It Together, was entitled National Anthem, which melds sculpture, collage, photography to create collisions in reference to Iranian politics throughout the past century. Shanna Marola, and I kind of want to say, you know, Shanna, I love the two of these emerging artists together. And when Shanna came to me with the images that she wanted to use, she wasn't quite sure exactly how they would present themselves. So this is an example where my hands got a little dirty and where she and I both kind of developed this sort of new system for her images to exist. These sort of kind of like protest signs kind of structures. Shanna is a visual artist and photojournalist and legal worker. In addition to her studio practice, she has been a human rights observer during political uprisings across the country, from the struggles of water rights in Detroit to the front lines of Ferguson and to Standing Rock. She's been to all of those places. Her collages and her constructed landscapes are informed by those events. Shanna is interested in how these events shape our identity and also our relationship to one another. Another exhibition, and this was curated at River House Arts, a building in downtown Toledo, was Ben Schoenberger's Beautiful Pig. This is an exhibition I've actually curated, I think now 3 times, one in Chicago and 2 of them in Ohio. You know, Ben's a fascinating artist, and he works with material that is really difficult for, I think, the general population to digest. But I think when he talks about it and when other people write about it, we begin to think about this work differently. Ben's work focused on themes surrounding archiving, identity, objectification, and outline. Several of his projects are seriously long-term, involving layering, rearranging, and augmenting created or found imagery within the context of an archive. Schoenberg basically builds all of this material and breaks it down and sort of repurposes it a new way. Through an organizing process, as he calls it, his work aims to address the complexities of systems that obscure how we see ourselves and other through image. The final artist I wanted to share is Renee. I was really excited when a friend of mine told me about Rowan's work. Rowan came from Brooklyn and was getting, you know, some attention in Brooklyn, and she came to Michigan to study at the U of M for a master's degree. And so Brian being Brian, I drove up there and had to meet her, and we developed a great friendship and created this exhibition, No Honor, No Heart. To tell you a little bit about Rowan's work, their work explores how queer identity is mediated by the law. Through image, text, and installation, Renee elaborates themes of authorship, representation, and erasure in state records and personal archives. They appropriate and transform official records through a labor-intensive process that engage their genderqueer body. These artifacts become the sort of counter-archive that repairs history of trauma, articulating new aesthetics and possibility for pleasure under conditions of abjection. No Honor, No Heart was the first iteration of a larger project titled Together But Separate, where Renee created a body of work exploring a 2013 legal dispute with a former partner and collaborator who was a copyright lawyer over ownership of nude images of their own body.
Thanks, Brian. And I think there's something to be said about the significance of artists like Rowan, who you gave a solo exhibition to. You know, the power of having that solo exhibition at a university gallery is huge. And that's like a whole other conversation we could have, right? The difference of these emerging artists having all these group shows on their CV versus finally having a solo show. Doesn't matter where that is, but it's really pivotal. So a support of a curator like yourself was just really transformational. Thank you both for sharing those examples. And I want to remind the audience, you know, if any questions came up when some of those artists were presented, feel free to include those on the Q&A box and we can come back and talk more about them. Or if you have any other questions that are coming up that you'd like to ask Renin, Brian, or myself, please include those. I'm just going to quickly show one or two artists and then we'll dive back into some other conversation. So just a reminder, I'm in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State, and I'm working at the Western Gallery of Western Washington University. And along with working with artists in large shows from Osamu Noguchi to Nancy Holt, I also get to work with BFA artists. So, you know, I see this full spectrum of established artists, very art historical established artists, and then I get to dive in and do the fun stuff with the BFA artists. So I wanted to share a little bit of a few of these artists. So, so this is of the 2020 BFA exhibition. And then obviously there is a group show. So there's about, I think this one was 12. But I just want to talk about one of them. So this is the work of Sarah Kendall. This is a mock-up of the trailer home that she grew up in. And I remember meeting Sarah early on in her studio, and she was doing a lot of really, really interesting work, mainly on paper. So installation was quite a surprise, you know, when it came to be to create this sculptural installation, you know, something immersive. She was doing a lot of relief prints and screen prints based on burlesque and identity and who she was. But then she came to this moment of realizing she wanted to dive right into herself. And bringing forth the space that she grew up in that is no longer accessible. You know, she was really and continues to be defined by her childhood home and childhood space that is no longer available. You know, a place in your childhood that feels so out of your control, but now you're controlling it. What does that mean? As an artist and using this unique opportunity to be in the Western Gallery, a professional gallery, to show your work, Sarah really took a step outside of her comfort zone of just, you know, a printmaker to create a whole installation that you can walk in and out of. So as you can see, we staged this in the center of the gallery. Sure, I could have placed it, you know, up against a wall and created a specific room, but we loved the idea of the audience being able to walk around this and gain curiosity and see it truly as an immersive sculpture space. So on the walls, a lot of the relief printing is the wood paneling on her side, which was so indicative of her childhood home. That was something so important to her. That tactile material, that visual of the wood panels brings her right to that moment of her childhood home. But, you know, she has these enlarged critters that she's paper mache'd and created in there to enlarge this idea of the childhood lens, because there were critters like that. And when you're young, they look massive. And so she really played to this idea of the childhood in herself. And what's really amazing is Sarah not only created this installation and went beyond the printmaking norms of a framed show that you put on the wall. Sarah also activated this space through performance. So here she is in this persona of what she calls as the ideal female that was expected of her when she was a little girl, or at least what she grew up believing was an ideal. And that to me spoke, I was blown away by the performativity and the immersive quality of her work, and then the presence of herself coming in and out of this. So seeing this as a student, a BFA student presenting this work, it just felt really profound. And when she talks about her work, it is very much steeped in her identity and this vulnerability of displaying this place. You know, what will people think, you know, knowing that I grew up in a trailer home. And she's not saying it was a negative. She's saying it was really imperative and a significant part of who she is, and she looks to it fondly. Sure, there were some moments that were over-sexualized, and there's some challenging histories there that she's working through, but it also defines who she is, and she's proud of where she came from. And I think that's really, really significant. And this installation, she's called it Double Wide, and that also pertains to how she sees herself and her body shape. She's like, that's something that people's called me. It's how I feel I am, but that's just who I am, you know. And there's something to be said that literally the title is articulating that as well. So every part of this was meticulously constructed and based off of her identity, and it's still very much who she is. And she definitely gets emotional, you know, talking about this work. But what I love within the university gallery is what this means for engagement and for people to come in and interact and experience and create their own sense of identity when they experience this work. And I think that's where these layers of identity unfold, is not only is the artist creating identity work, but as people come in and experience it, they pull their own identities and work through their own childhood memories as well. I can think specifically on at least a few people that came in and sat down and were like, this feels like where I grew up. I totally get this space. I totally understand it. So there's something to be said there about these emerging artists and work related to identity that's so approachable to audiences of all ages. And our students just really appreciated the vulnerability of Sarah's work. And then this year, 2021, so this just wrapped up in June, was our other cohort. This exhibition I felt was really related to materials. And so this exhibition, I think we had 12 exhibiting artists, all different media. But I just want to talk really quickly about this artist, Chloe Dicter. She created this installation of multiple elements of her body of work, which are cyanotypes on matzah crackers. There's also cyanotypes on eggshells. And so right away, I'm sure you can imagine how fragile it felt to have this work up. I mean, she's doing cyanotype on food material, so very fragile. But Bashert, what it's meant to be will be. Chloe Dicter grew up in a Jewish household, Jewish family. And her grandfather would always say, Bashert, you know, kind of what's meant to be will be. And so that was really influential to her. So what we're looking at here are these cyanotypes on matzah crackers that eventually decay and fall apart. And another part of this installation, she has vessels full of the crumbs of previous cyanotypes. But these are images of her family's heritage that was given to her. An aunt was going to throw them away, and she now holds them. And they were just going to be tossed aside. So she's literally the holder of her family's heritage. And she is recreating their images on these matzah crackers to illustrate the cracks and decay in her family and heritage, but also thinking larger about the Jewish identity, the color of blue and its significance in Jewish tradition, and matzah crackers and food. But Chloe really took a step. You know, as a photographer, she had other ideas for installation, but when this family identity fell on her lap, she knew she felt charged to create this body of work. And it was just a really impressive display. And she was really inventive and open to allowing such a vulnerable material and process to be open to the gallery. And it caught a lot of people's attention, and it was also very emotional. You know, what does it mean to be looking at these portraits of family members that are no longer here, and you're the sole owner of these works and these portraits that you're portraying on a decaying surface. Okay, so those are my two artists. So I don't know if Brian and Renee, if you have anything that's come up on identity in terms of some of the artists that we've talked about. I don't want to skip too fast into my next question. Do you have any thoughts at the moment before I move on to our next question? Okay. So something before we get to some of the questions that I've seen here. I think both of you have talked about this already, but I think we should talk a little bit more about projects beyond the gallery with emerging artists. And I think also, I don't know if you each shared this, but Brian, I know you did a little bit talking about how hands-on you are when you're working with emerging artists. Renin, I was wondering if maybe you could share about Loud Art and that project, you know, getting outside, if I'm right, that's outside of the gallery and encouraging artists to do things a little bit more experimental. Maybe if you could start us off and share about that, and then Brian and I can chat too about, or we can chat about other experimental spaces.
Yeah, so not having a lot of space that's dedicated to art makes you really creative, and makes you ask people who wouldn't usually be a part of this scene to be a part of this scene. So just like how Brian said, it was a lot of empty buildings. There was a lot of large spaces that would usually be used for other things like co-working spaces and things like that. But it was a challenge to get people on board with that, but also we have to take permission for everything in Saudi. So we have to get I have to get permission to show in a specific space. So I'd have to get one permission that says I can show here, and another permission for each and every artwork. So they want to like really look at the artwork. What's the art talking about? Is it sexual? Is it religious? Is it whatever? And so it was definitely challenging, and not being in a museum space or in a typical gallery space where that's really easy to do. But to get artists to feel like it's still of value to be in this space. You don't have to be in a white cube. You don't have to have an approval from an institution or a label for this to be exciting, fun, and worth connecting with an audience about. And when you're in these spaces, it really breaks down the barrier with people who find art spaces to be scary or intimidating or classist. And that's what's exciting about working in non-traditional spaces and working outside of a gallery setting, is that you get a whole new audience that you wouldn't actually get. Because if you show work in a mall or in a storefront, and I see that more over here as well. But that's what Loud Art was all about. It was about using outside spaces, getting artists to be more experimental with their mediums, and yeah, just thinking outside of the box that's been created for us. Oh, we lost Tammy. Oh, Tammy's back. Brian, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's really amazing what I guess younger emerging artists are doing. You know, I did an exhibition actually in a basement in Cleveland, which was one of my favorite exhibitions I think I've ever done. You know, I see emerging artists throughout Ohio, even in the Midwest, looking at garages, you know, being really sort of, you know, experimental about the spaces they use. And I agree. I mean, I think it adds a lot of challenge for some artists to think about their work in these other spaces, but I think it's also exciting for the public. You know, it's kind of amazing actually to think about, like, you know, how much, you know, someone can take over a space and just completely change it, and you walk in and never realize you're in a garage. It's pretty great.
Thank you. Sorry, my connection buzzed out there for a moment. Thanks, Brian and Renin. So I do want to get to some of these questions. First one, would love to hear from our speakers. What are the most successful strategies you have found in engaging emerging artists, and what have you found is less successful?
Can you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yeah, successful strategies in working with or engaging emerging artists, and maybe unsuccessful strategies, things that did not turn out well?
Yeah, I mean, with me, it's easy. It's communication. You know, I mean, the successful ones are where, you know, the artist and I are communicating quite often, and we're understanding each other. The less successful ones have been where communications weren't understood or weren't enough. I think that's really, it comes down to that for me. communication and our ability to develop a relationship.
Mm-hmm. And let's be honest, sometimes working with contemporary artists, that can be challenging. Not every artist is a communicator, right? I see Renin's eyes like, but am I right? I mean, that can be challenging sometimes. Is there something you want to add, Renin?
It's challenging. There's a lot of therapy involved, and there's a lot of, just like being really soft and holding space for their emotions. But that gets easier, I guess, the more you work on that side of yourself. But definitely communication is a big one. I also feel like knowing the boundary of what to get involved in and what not to. Sometimes it's good to give your opinion and your advice on specific things. And sometimes there's like a boundary where it's like, no, that's your work. Like that's that you definitely need to work on that part by yourself. I can't give you advice on that part. So that was also difficult to like make sure that the work is really theirs, but I know where the places are that I can help and where I shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. That's huge. Having professional boundaries, working with emerging artists. And Brian, I know you are so personable. You connect with people on all levels. But I think that's so true. You got to set those boundaries, especially with emerging artists. But you want to continue to support them. I don't know if either of you said anything about things that maybe weren't successful. I mean, I know you said, Renee, maybe getting your hands into too much, not setting boundary. Anything else come up? Because I do want to talk about what's challenging, working with emerging artists. Is there anything that comes to mind?
I mean, I think, sometimes for me, it's keeping things focused. That's also a very sort of challenging component of it, especially when you're doing a sort of large group exhibition with a lot of, sort of younger emerging artists, making sure that everything is going on with each of their works and that they're going to be there at a certain time and they're going to fulfill what you want to do. I mean, that's challenging. And there's been some exhibitions, larger group exhibitions, where I've had to shift, literally 5 hours before opening, so yeah, I would say, you got to keep focus on a lot of things with larger exhibitions.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question from the audience. Thinking about aligning our work with emerging artists with broader movements towards material equity in the art world, how do you approach conversations about compensation?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
Compensation for them?
I'm assuming so.
Yeah. When Contemporary Art Toledo does an exhibition, we sort of have that sort of River House Arts Gallery with my kind of counterpart, Paula Baldoni. That's helpful in working with those young artists in developing prices for their work and actually helping them think about what it means to sort of sell this work. At the university, it's more of an honorarium type of situation. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think when you get outside of the university, yes, I think there is more conversation about if you're selling this work, where you're pricing it at, in those types of things.
Yeah, I think even more specifically, someone else commented on the question, right? Like talk about emerging artists in non-traditional spaces, outside the box, garage, basement projects. What does that look like in terms of compensation, Renin?
I've really been trying to work hard on this specific topic. I think it's really important that we discuss it more and more, especially with people that are funding the arts, the people that want to support the arts. It's been difficult to explain why we need to pay the artist beforehand. So the way that I came about it in my exhibitions, because they were large group exhibitions with like 20 artists, 25 artists in them, it would be, okay, how much do you need to make this work? I can get, hopefully secure that for you. So if it's something that requires more than a specific amount of money, then I try my best to make sure that I secure that funding to produce the work at least. But beyond that, it is like a pricing structure. I try my best to make sure that everybody's work gets sold, and that's why we move. It's a traveling exhibition. I move from a city to a city, and hopefully everybody gets something out of it. I pay for everything, but it's definitely a discussion about, if I'm asking artists to make work, I need to pay them. So that's always on my mind, and it's always a struggle, but hopefully those things become more clear soon.
I know with Contemporary Art Toledo, Paula and I work really hard getting community businesses involved, and they sometimes come through with a lot of financial support that we can then give back to those artists for some of our projects. And so to me, that's another important kind of component, is really getting the community to recognize the importance of these young emerging artists and have them support them.
Absolutely. Here's another question. Why do you think emerging artists are centering an identity in their practice at this moment in time more than before?
I don't know. I don't know if, I think the pandemic may have something to do with it a little bit, but I think a lot of artists have been working with identity for the longest time. But I think, for me, it's become more apparent that some emerging artists are doing a really good job of it right now, and I want to get that out there. Do you have something better to say, Renee?
I'm hoping that it's because we're just more connected. Like, everybody's more connected because of the internet, because of social, because of these things, and these ideas of identity are being widely discussed. And so it's kind of like a groupthink situation where it's like, oh, that's your ancestry. I wonder what my ancestry is. I wonder why I am the person that I am. Like, that's why I'm interested in myself and my identities, because I'm seeing everybody going through that process, and it's interesting to me. With like projects like 23andMe and DNA testing and all of these things coming up, and people like really getting into the like science of it all, maybe that's then permeating into just the philosophy of it all. Like, why am I me?
Well, it's also, I think, identity is being under attack currently in a lot of situations, even with the idea of, identity politics. So, I think it's that space there where I think a lot of artists are saying, look, this is what I am, this is who I am, these things are important, I want to share that with others. And I agree that it is about connection.
Yeah, I would say our cultural landscape and the protests and the movements that we've seen over the past few years of voicing things that have previously been hidden and not spoken to. I think, especially for me in a university setting, students are really using their voices as a platform to speak to things that their parents never talked about, for example. And when I do these studio visits, I feel that they're so charged to speak truth and speak honestly and speak to realities that previously weren't spoken about. And they hate that, things were so clouded for so long. They're like, I never got to do this. I never got to talk about this, but I want to talk about this. I want to present this. So that is something, and that's, unique too, to the Pacific Northwest and this liberal school that I'm at, and the general nature of the students. They're all about advocacy and identity. and rights, human rights. I mean, it's just a completely different landscape than I was in Toledo before. It feels very different. So I think it depends on where you are too. But I think that's a great question. Why are people more centered on identity than they were before? I don't know if we'll know, but it seems to be a more general interest also from the greater audience. When I think about exhibitions that have been coming out in major museums and other museums around the world, the ones that people are really driven to are those that are speaking to histories that have previously been hidden or tucked away or not spoken to. And so I think there's something to be said there, the success and the draw that people are wanting these narratives and stories that were previously not spoken to. And emerging artists are diving right into that and accepting the vulnerability of putting themselves out there.
I do totally agree with you. I was about to say that I think there's something to say when your audience connects so deeply with what you're trying to say. And once you feel that with another artist, you're like, oh my God, I'm connecting with this person that I've never met before. Then you want to create things that are similar to that and give that same feeling, and that other people can also connect with you in that specific way. So definitely there is that success feeling is great also for artists to feel, not just show work, but to then have a reaction that's more than just I like it, I don't like it. Yeah.
And I can't help but think, I teach museum studies courses and have been in larger encyclopedic museums as well as small university ones. And I think another theme I see with a lot of contemporary artists, at least the ones I like to work with, they're really critiquing the institution and they're using their identity to do so. They're walking through the American galleries and they're like, something needs to change. Like, this isn't a real story. I can present a real story. And I think there is something to be said there. And I think students, BFA, MFA, students of all natures are walking through these institutions and recognizing that histories need to be interrupted. And there needs to be more equity within these gallery spaces. And that's just something that comes to mind also that I bring up when I teach a museum studies course on architecture. That's all they want to talk about is the issues with access. A lot of these students in art history and art. So they're charged to make change. And I think it's easy for them to go off of their own identity because they can be confident, but like, I know this story and I want to speak to this. So I don't know, there might be something said to that. So we're getting close to time. Brian, Renin, is there anything else in terms of emerging artists, these early career artists, and identity that maybe we've skipped over, something we haven't addressed? Is there anything that stands out to you that you want to bring to light?
I mean, for me, I think it's important with every exhibition that I do that there's some type of programmatic element that goes with it. Mm-hmm. And I've found that didactics work to a certain extent, but when the artist is out there present, speaking about the work, mm-hmm. it seems to affect the viewer in a greater way. Mm-hmm. So I think, if the work is difficult to digest, if the work is layered and nuanced, I think it's really important that we think about the different programs that can come with it, mm-hmm. whether it's the artists themselves or getting other experts in to talk about certain issues. That's when I really truly have seen more people come together and come out of an exhibition experience with a greater knowledge and a greater need to sort of want to connect with someone else. And you don't have to make a huge argument now that that's probably what we need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think curators, speaking for myself, I'm drawn to those artists that are wanting to have those hard conversations and show difficult material like Ben's work that you showed, Brian. It's like, that's the stuff we want. We want to bring in these conversations. And, we didn't even talk about programming and activating these spaces and the importance that is. But Brian,
it should be noted too, and you know this, Tammy, Ben's work got really great critical reviews, and it got some really negative critical reviews. So, I think about that. I think about those dangers and those hurdles with some artists, but I also start to understand the importance of it. And the space, if you will, that comes about when tough issues are brought up through art, and people have that sort of space to talk about things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. That's why, I'm so thankful to these emerging artists who are willing to be daring, and to give us, a part of themselves to put out there and have these conversations with the public that we get to help foster, but kind of also sit back and watch them grow and nourish through how it's exposed and given to the public. So I know that, to me as a curator, is one of the best pleasures.
Yeah, a few of my emerging artists don't even have time to show with me anymore. They're doing really fine. So I mean, that's what I love. I love as they emerge, they get more emerged. And they don't have time to do things, and they're getting bigger and better things.
Yeah. Renin and Brian, any projects coming up with emerging artists in particular that you're excited about?
Right now I'm working with an artist very closely. Her name is Zahra Al-Ghamdi. I really feel like I didn't showcase her work. It's hard to show on a screen. It's more landscape art and formal work, but
awesome.
I'm really excited to work with her and grow her presence and just work on her stuff. But yeah, this is the artist that I'm working with right now, and I'm really concentrating on her and her process.
Do you have a specific exhibition or site that you're working on?
I'm kind of I've taken a new role, which is different than the curator role, but I'm just working with her directly, kind of as a manager, I guess. Okay. But yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. I feel like I can help her a lot in her process.
Awesome. Brian, what about you?
Contemporary Art Toledo is working on a project at this very eccentric garden out literally in the middle of a cornfield, about 15 miles. It's called Shadell Gardens. And it's a super eccentric place. Our goal is to really get contemporary artist sculpture out in that space, to really start talking in rural spaces about contemporary art. It's relatively easy to do what we do if it's in the sort of city limits of Toledo. So our goal and our excitement is, well, what happened if we go out to a barn, if we go further out from the city and really get into those rural counties in Ohio that surrounds Toledo and do some events with emerging artists and see how that space sort of likes it or not like it, I guess. Yeah.
Awesome. I can't wait to hear about that project. I love the idea of interrupting that flat Ohio landscape. That sounds fantastic. Well, we are at time. Thank you, audience. It's been a pleasure having you all join us today. Thank you for your contributions and your participation, your questions, and your interest in this webinar, because I know that some of you that are listening in are going to go on to support some really significant artists. So I hope that this gave you some more topics and tools to take with you on that endeavor. And I know also many of you are quite experienced in this. So thanks for jumping in and listening and hearing about some of these artists that we had to talk about today. Renin, Brian, thank you so much for contributing your time, your knowledge. It's been such a pleasure to have a conversation with you about things we're all deeply, inspired by today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Tammy.
And everyone, again, thank you for joining. This has been recorded. Thank you to AAMC for hosting this. If you missed anything or if you want to go back and see some of the artist names, take a look at the recording and you can get those names. But thank you, Brian and Renee. Thank you, AAMC. We're closing this webinar.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Monica Valenzuela, Program Manager for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Thank you for joining our program today, and a special thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise with us. A recording will be available on our website, artcurators.org, and our YouTube channel shortly. Please help support our capacity to continue programs such as today's event by making a donation today. A gift of any amount will have a direct impact on our work. Thank you, stay well, and join us again soon.